Hi all, welcome back to the 5th video in this series on the operatic voice. In the last video we explored the rare contralto voice type, which is traditionally a voice type assigned to women. I say traditionally because things are changing all the time when it comes to defining gender. Voice doesn't necessarily have to be gendered. And in this video we'll be discussing the countertenor. Traditionally, the countertenor was assigned to male voices, so we're moving on to the classical men now. As you know, I'm currently in the process of writing an opera that includes trans voices as well as more traditional operatic voices. Traditional operatic voices, in the sense that they adhere to the traditional categories that this lecture series is exploring. And so I thought, because I'm writing this opera, I should do some intense research into traditional voice categories and make a comprehensive lecture series about my findings. Of course, it's absurd to categorise everyone's voice into these labels, but these labels do help us understand vocal capabilities better. We must remember also that people are human, and there will be exceptions to every rule and every category that we explore. So, without further ado, let's explore the countertenor voice. While this high male voice type was popular in the 1600s, it fell out of fashion for several hundred years until the mid-20th century when composers started bringing it back. Apart from these newer roles from composers like Philip Glass and Benjamin Britten, and me, countertenors tend to sing Baroque roles that were originally written for castrati. We will discuss castrati in greater detail in the next video. Now let's have a look at the vocal characteristics and range. Countertenor singers typically rely on their head voice or falsetto to hit the high notes that they need. A countertenor is the highest male singing voice with a range similar to that of a mezzo-soprano or contralto. So this is an interesting thing to note. The range is similar but the term is different, suggesting that gender is a key feature in defining these voice types. This does make sense to me because there is a significant timbral difference between the biological cis male and cis female means of voice production. There just is. But this gendered way of categorising voice also causes huge confusion for me as a composer writing for a combination of traditional operatic voices and modern trans operatic voices. The opera I'm writing is literally forcing me to undo all that embedded knowledge of classical voices because, for instance, I'm working with females whose voice timbre is closer to that of, say, a traditional tenor voice, and I'm working with non-binary people who have voice types that resemble traditional mezzo-sopranos, for instance. I'm also working with traditional coloratura sopranos and baritones and bass singers in the traditional sense. And I feel like I'm doing this. I'm doing this with my preconceived ideas and my preconceived knowledge and my rethinking of voices because what I know and have imbued is being rethought because voice doesn't have to be gendered. And I have made mistakes. I have made mistakes during this process of writing the opera, as you will be able to watch in my series on writing an opera. Enjoy. It gets confusing sometimes. But I like that. I like learning about this. Do you know what I mean? Like, a male who sings a soprano range might be classed as a soprano. Or they might be classed as a countertenor. Because their gender does not come into it. But timbre does influence the vocal quality, and timbre is usually traditionally categorised according to gender. I think this is important to mention because it highlights how we're constantly tripping up on our own preconceived knowledge generally, and how this defines our outlook on life. We can't be so boundaried if we want to be freer than we are. I'm diving into another topic now though, so if you want to know more about this, check out my videos that talk about the overall meaning of this opera that I'm writing and the meaning we're trying to convey to an audience. Also check out my videos on dialectics, which explore this notion of definitions in more detail. You can also read my PhD, which touches on this topic in the form of musical styles and the impossibility of thinking outside the box. Okay, digression over, back to the topic at hand. An example of a Baroque countertenor role is Medora from Handel's Orlando. Other famous countertenor roles include Akhenaten from Glass's Akhenaten, Oberon from Britain's A Midsummer Night's Dream, Julius Caesar from Handel's Julius Caesar, There aren't as many famous countertenors singers since the voice is fairly rare, and there still aren't a lot of roles available, but according to sfopera.com, a few of note include Anthony Roth Costanzo, Felipe Jarowski, Jakub Józef Orlinski, Bjorn Mehta. There's also George Balsa, who is directing the opera I'm composing. He sang at our workshops in Lisbon. He was filling in until we found a countertenor. He's actually both a countertenor and a bass. Literally 2 voices inside that one man. It's interesting writing for him because he has his lowest note in his countertenor range and his highest note in his bass range. But because he has to switch between his 2 voices, singing those pitches one after the other is harder than it might otherwise appear to be on paper. Check out my video on writing for the opera. I talk more about that in detail. Anyway, I digress again. Stop making me digress, you. I'm blaming you. Right, countertenor subcategories. Countertenors are often broken down into 3 subcategories. We have the Sopranist, or male soprano, the Haute-Contre, and the Castrato, which we'll be looking at in detail in the next video. Now let's have a look at the Sopranist. A Sopranist, also Sopranista or male soprano, is a male singer who is able to sing in the vocal tessitura of a soprano, usually through the use of falsetto or head voice vocal production. We will talk more about this shortly because I have some issues with that phrase. Able to sing in the vocal tessitura of a soprano, presumably female soprano, with the use of falsetto or a head voice vocal production. We'll get onto that more in a moment, just put a pin in that. Anyway, this voice type is a specific kind of countertenor, the Sopranist. Now, a Sopranist is able to sing in the soprano vocal range, which is approximately between C4 and C6, though at times may expand somewhat higher or lower. Higher. Now, cis-born men of all voice types can possess the wide-ranged and effective falsetto or head voice needed to produce the contralto, mezzo-soprano and soprano vocal ranges. And some countertenors can sing up into the female vocal tessitura using the modal register, that is the normal singing production, and they need not employ any falsetto. In rare cases, an adult man may be able to sing the soprano range using his normal or modal voice, that's a high chest voice, and not a falsetto, and this is due to endocrinological reasons, such as is the case with the singer Radu Marianne. Now basically Marianne is an endocrinological castrato or natural castrato, that's what you'd call them, and this is according to Mark Brown in Bath Celebrates the Life of the Bed-Hopping Singing Star of the 1700s from The Guardian. If you want to read more about that. Well, apparently they were like majorly popular. Who knew? Because today it's all about having big balls. A natural castrato is a male singer who never went through puberty and is able to keep his unbroken voice intact. And this is where the endocrinological reasons come in, because endocrinological stuff is all to do with like the hormones, and it's very specific depending on it varies between biological men and biological women, because we have different organs and different hormones. And another way you might get a natural castrato, i.e. a cis male, another way a cis male may be able to sing soprano like a cis woman in their natural modal voice is a result of a larynx that has not completely developed, and this is allegedly the case of Michael Maniaci. Now, Remember when I told you to put a pin in that thing earlier? Able to sing in the vocal tessitura of a soprano, presumably female soprano, with the use of falsetto or a head voice vocal production. We'll get onto that more in a moment. Just put a pin in that. Here we go. I know we're entering tricky territory here in this video when it comes to using terms like male, female, and so on, because I understand that people identify in ways that differ from traditional biological definitions of male and female. Traditional definitions. And I have to mention this because all these voice categories are imbued in tradition. So when it comes to the term female vocal tessitura, bear in mind that tessitura refers to where the notes fall naturally depending on the physics of an instrument. So for instance, the bassoon's tessitura is low in the bass range, even though it can play super high. Those high notes resonate differently, and you can hear that it's not its tessitura. It still sounds beautiful. I love a high bassoon. The Rite of Spring, oh, just glorious. So it's the same way with the voice. So the female tessitura is going to be different from the male tessitura for biological reasons. And I mean traditional cis male, cis female. That doesn't mean that a cis-born male can't hit the pitches that are more prominent in a female tessitura. And typically those pitches would resonate differently, and to put it bluntly, you'd be able to tell that it's a cis man singing high. However, in some instances, due to specific biological factors, as I've already mentioned, cis men can sing in the typical female tessitura using their modal register and not employing falsetto. So there we go. Now, let's talk about controversy over the term male soprano. Always going to be an issue with something. So, typically the term soprano refers to female singers. It's imbued with tradition, this is how it came about. But at times the term male soprano has been used by men who sing in the soprano vocal range using falsetto vocal production instead of the modal voice. Now this practice is most commonly found in the context of choral music in England. However, these men are more commonly referred to as countertenors or sopranists. Now, according to James McKinney in his book, The Diagnosis and Correction of Vocal Faults, the practice of referring to countertenors as male sopranos is somewhat controversial within vocal pedagogical circles, as these men do not produce sound in the same physiological way that female sopranos do. The idea here being that, for example, Radu Marian can refer to himself as a true male soprano because he is able to sing in the soprano vocal range using the modal voice. And this is due to endocrinological reasons, as I've already mentioned. There's also other issues with the term male soprano, which I assume is connected to issues with the term boy soprano, which I talked more about in the treble video, the treble voice lecture, so check that out. Let's have a look at existing repertoire now. There is a large body of music for the male soprano. I've said male soprano. Okay, well, my research says there's a large body of music for the male soprano that was written when it was common to use a castrato. So that's where they're forcing endocrinological reasons onto a person by removing testicles. And the castrato, as a refresher, this is a voice type which no longer exists because the practice of castrating trebles was abolished before the end of the 19th century. Now, sopranists are very rare, since most countertenors can sing alto and mezzo-soprano parts, so they're not needed. Just use a countertenor, basically. In fact, probably because early famous countertenors were altos, like Alfred Deller, it was believed for a long time that countertenors can only be altos, and later mezzo-countertenors like David Daniels or Joachim Kowalski were recognised. Just a little bit of information there. Look these people up if you like. So while there is some modern repertoire written for countertenors, like my opera, sometimes written specifically for certain singers as well, like Britain's Death in Venice, which has a part that was written specifically for James Bowman. At present, there are only a small number of modern pieces written specifically for the sopranist vocal type, because they are very rare. An exception is Alfred Schnittke's 1995 opera Historia von die Johann Fausten, which calls for both a female alto and a male soprano, Mephistopheles. Well, my opera calls for a female tenor and a male countertenor. Shameless plug. Right, what's the character type of a Haute-Contre then? I wonder. So, this voice was predominantly used in male solo roles, typically heroic and amatory ones. Amatory ones? Is that like the lover? Or is it someone who just loved... This is where it gets interesting. Haute-Contre were also used in comic parts, even en travesti. En travesti.
En travesti.
So what is en travesti?
En travesti.
You might ask. Well, here's where things get even more interesting in terms of gender. Travesti is a theatrical term referring to the portrayal of a character in an opera, play or ballet by a performer of the opposite sex to that character. The word means disguised in French. Oh, it is French.
En travesti.
En travesti.
En travesti.
Now, depending on sources, the term may also be given as travesti, travesti, or en travesti. En travesti.
En travesti.
En travesti. Oh, so it sounds a bit like, so like transvestite. Travesti? A cross-dressing? Cross-dressing? Trans? A cross-vest? Is vestido is like your outfit? A cross-dress? Cross-dressing? Love etymology. Now, for social reasons, female roles were played by boys or men in many early forms of theatre. For social reasons, and travesti roles continued to be used in several types of context even after actresses became accepted on the stage. Well, why would you stop doing that? It sounds fun. The popular British theatrical form of the pantomime traditionally contains a role for a principal boy, a breeches role played by a young woman, and also one or more pantomime dames, female comic roles played by men. Similarly, in the formerly popular genre of Victorian burlesque, there were usually one or more breeches roles. Let's have a look at the vocal characteristics and range now. Now we've explored the character types of this Haute-Contre voice, let's discuss the Haute-Contre's vocal characteristics and range. The nature of the Haute-Contre has been the subject of much debate. Historically, English writers have translated the term as countertenor, which is not particularly helpful since the meaning of countertenor has also been the subject of considerable musicological controversy. Both terms are ultimately derived from the Latin contra-tenor, which might mean against the tenor, in the same way that contralto means against the alto, as I mentioned in the last video on the contralto. It is now generally accepted that the Haute-Contre sang in what voice scientists term modal, i.e. the speaking voice, and they perhaps used falsetto for their highest notes. A typical solo range for this voice was C3 to D5, considering that French 18th century pitch was as much as a whole tone lower than that of today, so that's taken into consideration. Now, though this high-pitched range might lead one to think of the Haute-Contre as a light voice, historical evidence does not bear this out. Gilliot was much praised for the strength of his high register, and the astronomer and traveller Joseph Jérôme Lefrançois de Lalande, talking about Gilliot, commented saying that one takes more pleasure in hearing a large volume than a small one. Lalande stated that Gilliot's range was identical to that of the famous tenor Angelo Amorevole. He also remarked that all those who succeeded, like Ross, had to shout to arrive at the tones of an Haute-Contre, except for Rousseau. But he had the smallest sound. So Haute-Contre was supposed to be a big shout. It reminds me of the spin toe pushed thing. Check out my last videos for more information about that. Anyway, the Rousseau that is being spoken about is Jean-Joseph Rousseau, opera singer, born in 1761, died in 1800, Paris, France, just in case you were wondering if it was that philosopher. It's not. The Haute-Contre is regarded by some authorities as similar to, or indeed identical with, the voice type described in Italian as tenore contraltino, and we will explore the tenore contraltino in the video about the tenor voice. So one thing at a time. Summary. Well, in this video we have explored the countertenor voice. We've also looked at the subcategories of the countertenor, which include the sopranist and the haute-contre. We've also briefly discussed gender in relation to this voice type, and the fun you can have with travesti roles. Bless me. In the next video, we'll be exploring the castrato. I'll see you there. Traditionally, this is where it gets interesting.